close your eyes for a moment and try to picture the world as it appears on any map you've ever seen. The coastlines, the continents, the islands scattered across blue oceans. Now imagine that everything you're picturing is wrong, not slightly inaccurate, but fundamentally incorrect. The shores you know, the beaches where cities now stand, the harbours where ships dock, none of them existed 12,000 years ago. The ocean was somewhere else entirely. We're told that human civilization began around 5,000 years ago in places like Sumer and Egypt, that before this there were only scattered tribes of hunter-gatherers living simple lives with simple tools. We're told that history is a straight line climbing upward from primitive to advanced, from ignorant to enlightened. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the textbooks are showing us only the final chapter of a much longer book, and all the preceding pages have been torn out and lost? Imagine standing on a beach at sunset, watching waves roll in across sand that stretches to the horizon. Now drop the ocean 400 feet. Suddenly you're standing on a cliff, and below you spreads a vast coastal plain extending miles and miles toward a distant sea. Cities could have stood there. Ports, temples, entire civilizations going about their lives, building and trading and watching these same stars we see tonight. All of it now rests beneath water so deep that sunlight has never touched those ruins in 10,000 years. Something happened approximately 12,000 years ago. Something catastrophic enough to erase nearly every trace of what came before. The geological record shows it. The ice cores preserve it. The myths remember it. Over 200 cultures around the world, separated by oceans and mountains, cultures that never met or traded or shared stories, all tell the same tale. The world ended in water. The old world drowned, and from the survivors came everything we now call history. There are structures standing today that shouldn't exist according to our accepted timeline. Stone monuments demonstrating mathematical precision that supposedly primitive people couldn't have possessed. Astronomical knowledge encoded in architecture that requires centuries of careful observation to develop, yet appearing suddenly, fully formed, without any evidence of the learning process that should have preceded it. Temples aligned to celestial events with accuracy that modern surveyors struggle to match. The standard explanation is that ancient people were simply more clever than we give them credit for, that given enough time and labor, anything can be accomplished with primitive tools, perhaps. But that explanation requires us to ignore certain uncomfortable questions. Why do the oldest structures often demonstrate the greatest sophistication? Why does Egyptian engineering appear to decline over time rather than improve? Why do mathematical constants like pi and phi appear in monuments supposedly built by people who hadn't yet invented writing? These aren't fringe questions asked only by conspiracy theorists in darkened rooms. These are gaps in the narrative that archaeologists themselves acknowledge, even if they disagree about what those gaps mean. The evidence exists. The anomalies are real. What remains disputed is the interpretation. So we begin this journey not with certainty, but with curiosity, not claiming to have all the answers, but willing to examine the questions that linger in the spaces between what we know and what we're told. The late night hours are good for this kind of thinking. When the world quiets and the usual distractions fade, the mind can wander into territories that daylight makes seem impossible. The coastlines were different. The climate was different. The very shape of the continents beneath our feet was different. And if the world was so thoroughly transformed, what else might have changed? What else might have been lost when the waters rose and the old world vanished beneath waves that have guarded its secrets ever since? We're about to explore a world that doesn't appear on any map, inhabited by people who left no names we can pronounce, who built cities that crumbled into the deep. But first, we need to understand who they were. Morning arrives differently when your city faces an ocean that no longer exists. The sun rises over waters that have been gone for 12,000 years, casting light across a harbour where now only fish swim through broken columns and crabs scuttle across floors that once knew the footsteps of crowds. Try to imagine waking in such a place, not as a primitive hunter crouched in a cave, but as someone living in a settlement that might have housed thousands, in a structure built with knowledge we assume didn't exist yet. The day begins before dawn, as it has for as long as anyone can remember. Fires are kindled with techniques passed down through generations, but perhaps not the crude friction methods we picture when we think of ancient people. There is evidence suggesting some pre-flood societies understood principles of engineering and construction that wouldn't reappear for thousands of years. The homes themselves might have incorporated designs we'd recognize, foundations set with astronomical alignments, walls positioned to capture specific angles of sunlight, ventilation systems that maintained comfortable temperatures without the need for constant heating or cooling. breakfast might have included grains we no longer cultivate, fruits from species that went extinct when the climate shifted, fish caught from reefs that are now at depths where only specialized equipment can reach. The assumption has always been that agriculture began around 10,000 years ago, a sudden invention that transformed human society. But what if it was a rediscovery? What if these morning meals represented knowledge that had been old even then? The work of the day would have varied by individual, by season, by need. We know from underwater archaeological surveys that structured settlements existed far earlier than conventional timelines suggest. Off the coast of India near Dwarka, sonar has mapped what appear to be walls and roads resting beneath 100 feet of water. Near Japan, the Yonaguni monument shows angular formations, right angle cuts, and what look like deliberate terracing, all at depth suggesting they were built when sea levels were far lower. Near Cuba, researchers have documented geometric patterns on the ocean floor at depths that would require these structures to be impossibly old by standard chronology. These aren't natural formations that imagination has turned into ruins. These are structured, patterned, deliberately shaped environments that now serve as homes for marine life, instead of the human communities that once gathered there. The reluctance to investigate them further stems partly from the implications. If these are genuine archaeological sites, then the timeline shifts. The story changes, and perhaps there is comfort in the story we already have, the one that makes sense, the one that doesn't require rewriting every textbook and reconsidering every assumption. But let's return to that morning, to that day in a world we can only reconstruct through fragments and guesses. Perhaps there were specialists among these communities, astronomers tracking celestial patterns through decades of observation, engineers directing the construction of monuments we now find submerged and mysterious, mathematicians developing systems of calculation that would later be credited to cultures thousands of years more recent. The sophistication wouldn't have been uniform. Some settlements likely were simple, others complex. Some populations might have lived as hunter-gatherers while others cultivated crops and built in stone. The relationship with the natural world would have been intimate in ways we've lost. The stars weren't obscured by light pollution. The seasons followed patterns not yet disrupted by industrial intervention. Animals that are now extinct walked landscapes that are now ocean floor. Mammoths and giant sloths weren't museum reconstructions but neighbors, threats, resources, parts of the living world that surrounded daily existence. As the sun sets over this vanished world, as the day's work concludes and fires are banked for the night, perhaps there were gatherings, stories told, knowledge shared, the oral traditions that would eventually become the myths we now study, the flood legends that cultures across the globe would preserve through catastrophe and carry forward into the world that followed. But what made this world possible? What environmental conditions allowed civilizations to flourish in places we now consider uninhabitable? The answer lies in understanding just how different the Earth itself once was. The planet you are sitting on right now is not the planet they walked upon. The very shape of the world has changed, transformed so completely that showing them a modern map would be like showing them an alien landscape. The difference wasn't gradual. It wasn't subtle. It was the kind of change that erases civilizations and buries history beneath water and ice and time. During the last ice age, glaciers miles thick covered much of North America, Europe and Asia. These weren't just frozen landscapes. They were reservoirs holding unimaginable quantities of water that had been pulled from the oceans and locked into solid ice. Sea levels dropped nearly 400 feet below where they rest today. 400 feet. That is a 40-story building, worth of ocean, that simply wasn't there, exposing continental shelves we now consider deep ocean floor. Where today you need a submarine to explore, people once walked. Where modern ships navigate open water, there were coastal plains extending for miles, fertile lands fed by rivers that have long since drowned. The Persian Gulf was a river valley, possibly the location that inspired later memories of a garden paradise, an Eden that existed before the waters came. The Mediterranean was the sea we know, but a landscape of valleys and freshwater lakes, a completely different geography supporting completely different ecosystems. Indonesia and Australia weren't separate as they are now. A massive continental shelf called Sunderland connected them, a landmass larger than India that supported its own climate, its own populations, its own story. When the ice melted and the seas rose, Sunderland vanished almost entirely, leaving only the highest peaks as the islands we now call Indonesia and Malaysia. Everything else, the settlements, the roads, the evidence of whoever lived there, sank beneath tropical waters that have kept those secrets ever since. The climate itself was different in ways that seem almost impossible. Siberia, now a frozen wasteland, was temperate grassland where mammoths grazed in herds. The Sahara, now desert, was savanna with lakes and rivers supporting abundant life. The patterns of rainfall, the jet streams, the ocean currents, all of it operated according to configurations that no longer exist. The world was in many ways more hospitable, offering more livable land, more coastal territory, more opportunities for human populations to establish and grow. This is why the absence of evidence becomes less mysterious. If you are looking for pre-flood coastal cities, you are not going to find them on modern coastlines. You are going to find them hundreds of feet underwater, covered by sediment, transformed by millennia of current and pressure into formations that might not even look artificial anymore. We explored less than 5% of the ocean floor. We systematically surveyed even less. The lost cities, if they exist, remain lost, not because they never were, but because we haven't looked in the right places. Then something changed. Around 12,800 years ago, the climate shifted dramatically. The Younger Dryas period began, a mysterious return to Ice Age conditions that happened far too quickly to be explained by gradual climate cycles. Temperatures plummeted. Ice sheets that had been retreating suddenly advanced again. And then, just as suddenly, around 11,600 years ago, it ended. The ice melted rapidly. The seas rose, and the world we know began to take shape from the ruins of what came before. The theories about what triggered this catastrophe vary. Some researchers point to asteroid or comet impacts, citing evidence of platinum anomalies in geological layers worldwide. Others suggest massive solar events or volcanic eruptions. What remains undisputed is that it happened, that it was dramatic, and that it coincided precisely with the mass extinction of megafauna and the supposed beginning of human civilization. Perhaps civilization didn't begin then. Perhaps it began again, rebuilt by survivors who carried fragments of knowledge from the world that drowned, knowledge that would surface in the monuments and mathematics and mysteries of cultures we only now beginning to understand were far older, far more connected, and far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. But to understand what they knew, we need to examine what they left behind. There are objects in museum collections that don't belong in their display cases, not because they were stolen or misplaced, but because according to everything we think we know about history, they shouldn't exist at all. Hold one of these artifacts in your hands and you can feel the wrongness of it, the way it sits in time like a puzzle piece, forced into the wrong section of a picture. The edges don't match, the context doesn't fit, and yet there it is, undeniably real, undeniably ancient, undeniably impossible. In 1901, divers exploring a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera pulled up a corroded lump of bronze that would take decades to understand. When researchers finally managed to examine its interior, they found a device of staggering complexity, a machine with dozens of precisely cut gears, calibrated to track the movements of celestial bodies, predict eclipses, and map astronomical cycles. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be called, represented a level of computational sophistication that supposedly didn't exist again until medieval astronomical clocks appeared more than 1,000 years later. It wasn't primitive. It wasn't a lucky accident. It was technology, deliberate and refined, created by minds that understood principles we assume they could have known. In Iraq, archaeologists excavating ancient Mesopotamian sites discovered clay jars containing copper cylinders and iron rods, components that, when filled with acidic liquid, generate electrical current. The Baghdad batteries, as they recalled, shouldn't work, but they do. The standard explanation is that they were used for electroplating gold onto silver. But that explanation requires ancient Mesopotamians to have understood electrochemistry, a field we credit to scientists working thousands of years later. The alternative is that these weren't inventions at all, but remnants of knowledge inherited from somewhere, someone sometime before. Then there is the London hammer, a tool that looks entirely modern, wooden handle, iron head, except it was found encased in rock formation supposedly millions of years old. Geologists debate the dating. Skeptics question the context, but the hammer itself remains, refusing to fit comfortably into any timeline that makes sense. In the Temple of Dendera in Egypt, reliefs carved into stone walls show objects that look disturbingly like light bulbs, glass enclosures, filaments, what appears to be a power source. Egyptologists explain them as symbolic representations of mythological concepts, which may be true. But the specificity of the design, the technical precision of the depiction, leaves room for other interpretations. What if the symbols came first and the mythology later? What if these carvings preserved the memory of objects whose function was eventually forgotten, reinterpreted through the lens of religion when the original knowledge faded? There is a term for this kind of evidence: forbidden archaeology. Not forbidden in the sense of being illegal or hidden, but forbidden in the sense that it violates the established narrative. Academic institutions build careers on timelines and frameworks that took centuries to construct. When an artifact appears that doesn't fit, the pressure to explain it away, to recontextualize it, to minimize its implications, can be overwhelming. Paradigm shifts are uncomfortable. They require admitting that previous certainties were incomplete or wrong. They demand rewriting textbooks, reconfiguring theories, reconsidering assumptions that entire fields of study have built themselves upon. We like our history neat. We like progression that makes sense, primitive to advanced, simple to complex, ignorant to enlightened. Objects that violate this progression create cognitive dissonance, so we find ways to make them fit, or we quietly set them aside in storage facilities where they complicate the story we agreed to tell. But what if some of these artifacts aren't anachronisms? What if they re-evidence of continuity, fragments of knowledge that survived catastrophe, and were rediscovered by later cultures who didn't fully understand what they found? What if the reason we see occasional bursts of seemingly impossible sophistication in ancient contexts isn't because people got temporarily clever, but because they were working from blueprints, copying designs, following instructions handed down from a world that no longer existed? The objects whisper these questions. They sit in their cases corroded and mysterious, waiting for someone to hear what they were actually saying. But artifacts are portable, small, easy to dismiss as anomalies. What about the things too large to ignore, too massive to explain away? What about the structures? There are stones in this world that weigh more than 100 cars stacked together, cut with precision that would challenge modern laser-guided equipment, fitted so perfectly that you cannot slide a blade between them, positioned with astronomical alignments, accurate to fractions of a degree. And we retold they were moved and placed by people using copper chisels and rope. The Great Pyramid of Giza stands as perhaps the most analyzed structure in human history, yet it continues to defy complete explanation. Its base is leveled to within less than an inch across 13 acres. Its sides align to true north more accurately than the Greenwich Observatory built thousands of years later. The ratio of its height to its base perimeter encodes the mathematical constant pi with remarkable precision. Its internal chambers incorporate the golden ratio. The precision is accidental. The mathematics is coincidental. This was deliberate, calculated, executed with knowledge that supposedly didn't exist in 2500 BCE. The standard explanation involves massive labor forces, simple tools applied with great patience, and clever use of ramps that have never been found, and whose design remains theoretical because no one has successfully demonstrated how they would actually work at the required scale. It is possible. Many things are possible, given enough time and determination. But possibility isn't the same as probability, and the engineering challenges remain formidable, even with modern machinery. Travel to Bolivia and you'll find Puma Punku, where blocks of diorite and andesite, stones so hard they rank near diamond on the hardness scale, have been cut into interlocking shapes of extraordinary complexity. The precision is such that the blocks fit together like manufactured components, with perfectly flat surfaces and right angles that deviate by less than a millimeter. Some blocks show evidence of what appears to be machine tooling, with drill holes of uniform diameter and cuts that would require technology we assume didn't exist until the Industrial Revolution. Archaeologists date the site to around 500 CE, attributing it to the Tiwanaku culture. But there is no clear record of how they accomplished what modern stonemasons, even with diamond-tipped tools, struggle to replicate. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe stands as an archaeological impossibility that has forced reconsideration of what hunter-gatherers could achieve. Dated to approximately 11,600 years ago, it predates agriculture, predates pottery, predates metalworking, predates everything we thought necessary for constructing monumental architecture. Yet here are massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing 20 tons, quarried from bedrock, transported across difficult terrain, and erected in circles with sophisticated artistic reliefs depicting animals and symbols whose meanings remain mysterious. The people who built this supposedly had no villages, no permanent settlements, no complex social organization. They were, according to conventional understanding, just beginning to transition from nomadic hunting to settled farming. And yet they created something that required planning, coordination, specialized knowledge, and sustained effort across what must have been decades or longer. Peru offers Sacsay Huamin, where limestone blocks weighing up to 200 tons are fitted together in polygonal patterns, so precise that you cannot slide paper between the joints. These aren't T-simple rectangular blocks. They irregular, multi-sided shapes that interlock like three-dimensional puzzles. Each block here surface matches its neighbors perfectly despite having different angles, different dimensions, different orientations. The mathematics required to calculate such fits would challenge modern architects. The physical process of cutting and positioning them remains unexplained despite numerous theories. The common thread across all these sites is that conventional explanations require us to believe that ancient peoples accomplished with primitive tools what we would find difficult with modern technology, that they developed sophisticated mathematical understanding without writing to record their calculations, that they transported multi-ton stones across mountains and valleys using methods that leave no archaeological trace, that they achieved precision we struggle to match using techniques we can only theorize about. Or perhaps these structures weren't built by the cultures we've credited with them. Perhaps they were inherited, already ancient when later civilizations found them, restored and claimed but not originally constructed. Perhaps the knowledge required to create such monuments existed in the pre-flood world and was partially imperfectly preserved by those who survived to rebuild in the aftermath. The stones themselves cannot tell us, but they stand, impossible and real, waiting for explanations that actually account for what they are rather than what we think they should be. Knowledge can be more durable than stone, more persistent than artifacts, more revealing than any physical structure. It hides in plain sight, encoded in monuments and myths, preserved in measurements and mathematics, waiting for minds ready to recognize what it represents. And when you begin to look for it, you find it everywhere, astronomical understanding that required centuries of continuous observation, mathematical constants that demand sophisticated calculation, scientific principles that supposedly weren't discovered until modern times. Stand at Stonehenge during the summer solstice and watch the sun rise precisely through the heel stone, exactly as it did when the monument was built nearly 5,000 years ago. The alignment isn't approximate, it's exact. And it's not just the solstices, megalithic sites worldwide, track equinoxes, lunar cycles, planetary movements, and even the precession of the equinoxes. A cycle taking 25,920 years to complete that mainstream history credits to Greek astronomers in the 2nd century BCE. Yet structures built thousands of years earlier demonstrate knowledge of this precession, incorporating it into their orientations and measurements. In Egypt's desert, Nabta Playa contains a stone circle predating Stonehenge by a millennium, aligned to track star positions from over 6,000 years ago, with understanding of celestial mechanics that should have been impossible for the nomadic people credited with building it. The precision suggests not casual skywatching, but systematic astronomical study conducted over generations. Knowledge preserved and applied with purpose, we can measure but not fully explain. The Hindu Yuga system describes cosmic cycles spanning millions of years, with specific mathematical relationships between the ages. The Mayan long count calendar tracks time with precision that accounts for stellar drift and requires astronomical observations sustained across centuries. Greek myths, when examined closely, encode planetary cycles and celestial mechanics that some researchers interpret as astronomical knowledge disguised as stories about gods and heroes. The question becomes, did these cultures all independently develop such sophisticated understanding, or were they preserving fragments of knowledge inherited from predecessors who mapped the heavens long before? Then there are the maps. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, incorporates coastline details of Antarctica as it appears beneath the ice, information that shouldn't have been available until the 20th century, when ground-penetrating radar revealed the continent's true shape. The mapmaker claimed to have worked from older sources, charts dating back centuries or millennia. If true, those source maps were drawn when Antarctica was either ice-free or mapped by people with technology to see through ice. Either possibility disrupts conventional chronology. The Orontius Phineus map shows similar impossible knowledge. Cartographers drew these maps from something. The question is what and when and how. Mathematical knowledge shows similar patterns of premature sophistication. Babylonian tablets demonstrate understanding of Pythagorean triples more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. The Mayans independently discovered and used zero as a mathematical concept, a breakthrough we credit to Indian mathematicians, but which appeared in Mesoamerica without any documented cultural exchange. The Great Pyramid encodes pi and phi in its dimensions, constants requiring advanced mathematics to calculate and apply. These aren't isolated accidents, but systematic incorporation of mathematical principles into monumental architecture. Ancient metallurgy presents similar mysteries. Damascus steel possessed properties that modern metallurgists cannot fully replicate, despite access to electron microscopes and advanced analysis. The process was lost, the knowledge gone, leaving us with artifacts we can study but not reproduce. Roman concrete still stands after 2,000 years, outlasting modern formulations that crumble after decades. The recipe was lost when the empire fell. Ancient chemical knowledge, preserved in texts like the Egyptian Ebers Papyrus and the Indian Sushruta Samhita, describes surgical procedures and anatomical understanding that seems impossibly advanced for its era: brain surgery, plastic surgery, knowledge of circulation, and nervous systems that supposedly wasn't discovered until Renaissance anatomists began systematic dissection. The pattern repeats across disciplines and cultures. Knowledge appearing fully formed, sophisticated understanding without evidence of the developmental process that should have preceded it, capabilities that seem anachronistic in their contexts. The conventional explanation is independent discovery, parallel development, the inevitable forward march of human intelligence, eventually reaching similar conclusions. Perhaps these aren't discoveries at all, but rememberings, fragments of comprehensive scientific understanding, possessed by pre-flood civilizations and imperfectly transmitted through catastrophe to cultures that preserved what they could, applied what they understood, and lost what they couldn't maintain. The knowledge whispers of its origins, if we're willing to listen. But listening means accepting that what destroyed those origins was real, catastrophic, and comprehensive enough to erase nearly everything except these scattered traces.